When the world looks at India, a democracy of over 4 billion people, a rising economic power, and a cultural mosaic stretching back millennia, it's easy to marvel at its growth, progress, and optimism, but beneath that quiet resilience lies a growing tension that few outside the region fully grasp. India sits between two volatile neighbors, Pakistan and China. Both are nuclear-armed. Both have clashed violently with India in the past. And what sets India apart from other rising global powers is this. Instead of preparing for one war, India must quietly and continuously plan for the unthinkable, a two-front war that could erupt with little warning. The double front dilemma isn't a theory drawn up in war colleges. It's a lived reality. To the northwest lies Pakistan, with whom India has fought multiple wars since partition in 1947. The conflict is not merely military. It is historical, religious, and deeply emotional on both sides. Decades of skirmishes along the line of control, low C, compounded by cross-border terrorism and political mistrust, ensure that peace remains elusive. In the wake of incidents like the 2019 Pulwama attack and India's retaliatory Balakot airstrike, there's always the possibility that a single explosion, a single infiltration, or a miscalculation could lead to full-scale escalation. But while the world has long been aware of Indo-Pakistani tensions, the challenge from China is of an entirely different nature and, in many ways, more difficult to manage. The 3,000 kilometer long border between India and China remains largely undefined and fiercely contested. The 2020 Galwan Valley clash, where Chinese and Indian troops fought hand-to-hand with improvised weapons, was a brutal reminder that disputes over lines on a map can still cost lives even in the modern era. What made that moment chilling wasn't just the violence, but the silence that led up to it. There were no weapons fired, no formal declarations, just a high-altitude confrontation that ended in death and diplomatic confusion. What India faces today is a scenario that no nation wishes to contemplate: the possibility of a simultaneous conflict on both its northern and western fronts. Strategically, it's a nightmare. China brings overwhelming economic power, technological advancement, and a rapidly expanding military. Pakistan, with its agile military and familiarity with the terrain, brings unpredictability, asymmetric warfare, and a history of proxy conflict. Together, they form a threat that requires India to stretch its defenses, resources, and readiness across distinctly different geographic and tactical environments, from the snow-laden Himalayas, the deserts of Rajasthan, and the jungles of the Northeast. Preparing for two wars at once is not just a question of military strength. It is a question of national will and foresight. India, for much of its post-independence history, favored a posture of defensive engagement, but this approach is now being quietly recalibrated. The doctrine has shifted toward credible deterrence, which implies the capability to respond simultaneously and decisively to two adversaries without faltering. And this shift isn't loudly advertised or wrapped in bravado. It's playing out behind the scenes through infrastructure projects in border regions, quiet joint military drills, strategic airbase upgrades, and discrete troop movements that might never make front pages. This preparation, however, isn't just about reacting to threat. It's about deterrence through readiness, because the most effective wars are the ones never fought. India's leadership recognizes that hesitation or weakness in one area could embolden aggression in another. If Pakistan senses India's full attention is on China, it may seize the opportunity to stoke turmoil in Kashmir. If China believes India's forces are bogged down in a Western standoff, it could press its gains along the line of actual control. The only way to prevent either is to send a clear, quiet message to both adversaries: we are ready. What makes this situation especially complex is the unpredictability of motivation. China's ambitions are global. Its conflict with India is part of a broader competition for influence in Asia. Pakistan's intentions are more personal, rooted in unresolved history, ideological conflict, and national identity. One state wants to rewrite the regional power structure. The other wants to redefine borders born from partition. And India wants peace, but peace with preparation, peace with eyes wide open. Compounding the challenge is the rapid convergence of technology and warfare. Drones, cyber attacks, satellite surveillance, and non-state actors make clear battle lines increasingly irrelevant. Wars can now begin in the digital shadows and spill quietly into the physical world. In that sense, India is not only preparing for 2 wars, but potentially for 3: Pakistan, China, and an evolving, invisible battlefield no map can chart. So, while much of the international community is focused on India's economic growth, technological innovation, and diplomatic clout, the deeper story is far more sobering. This is a nation on guard, a nation silently reinforcing its borders and resolve, a nation that hopes it will never need to fight 2 wars at once, but is fully aware that hope alone is not a strategy. Because sometimes the greatest act of defense is the quiet preparation no one sees coming. While much of the world watches India for its booming tech industry, vibrant democracy, and expanding global soft power, what often escapes attention is the quiet transformation underway within its military and defense strategy. For decades, India's defense posture was largely reactive, shaped by the wounds of partition, the need to manage internal unrest, and the ever-present threat from Pakistan. But that posture is now shifting. Slowly, methodically, and with remarkably little noise, India is reforging its sword not for conquest, but for preparedness. And this preparedness is being built with a long view, not merely for a single conflict, but for the daunting possibility of having to defend itself on 2 fronts simultaneously. The transformation begins not with the obvious airstrikes, military parades, or speeches, but with infrastructure. In once neglected border regions, roads are now being built with urgency and precision. Airstrips, tunnels, and connectivity corridors are emerging in previously inaccessible Himalayan areas. These are not just enhancements for locals. They are logistical arteries critical to moving troops, equipment, and supplies in moments of crisis. With Chinese encroachment in the north and Pakistani hostility in the west, India understands that speed of deployment could decide the outcome of any future conflict. The terrain has not changed, but India's response to its strategic geography has. This modernization isn't just about building better roads or bases. It reaches deep into defense technology. India is investing massively in homegrown defense production through the Make in India initiative. For years, dependency on foreign weapon systems left Indian military planning vulnerable to delays, cost overruns, and diplomatic constraints. Today, however, The narrative is starting to shift. Indigenous production of fighter aircraft like the Tejas, missiles under the DRDO umbrella, and the development of advanced artillery systems are reshaping how India views its own capacity for sustained conflict. It's no small feat, because to build your own arsenal is to disentangle yourself from external pressures and to signal to the world that your security no longer hinges on outside approval. At the same time, India is strengthening its strategic deterrence with an eye toward multipolar threats. Satellite capabilities have grown, naval strength is expanding with new aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines, and cyber defense units are being trained to operate in the digital shadows where future wars may begin. For decades, India maintained a nuclear doctrine of minimal deterrence and no first use. That doctrine has held, but the military posture surrounding it has evolved from bare bones preparedness to the credible threat of swift retaliation. These are not declarations of aggression, but demonstrations of resolve, designed to dissuade any adversary from thinking India is caught off guard. The defense forces themselves, Army, Navy, Air Force, are undergoing doctrinal revisions, training for coordinated operations that factor in both land-based and high-altitude warfare from the deserts of Rajasthan to the icy heights of Ladakh. Integration across commands is creating a more unified and flexible force structure. The establishment of theater commands along anticipated reform is slowly gaining shape, aimed at ensuring that India no longer responds with fragmented forces, but with a synchronized, agile military machine. But beyond hardware and troop formations lies another critical development: alliances. India may not be part of a formal military bloc, but its participation in multilateral discussions like the Quad with the United States, Japan, and Australia signals a growing web of partnerships that serve as strategic hedges. These alliances are not treaties carved in stone, but understandings carved in trust. Joint military exercises, intelligence sharing, and defense deals subtly project a message: India does not stand alone. And although India retains its doctrine of strategic autonomy, its readiness to cooperate multilaterally suggests it understands the power of collective presence, particularly when dealing with China's expansive ambitions in the Indo-Pacific. American defense technology is now more accessible to India than ever before, thanks to security agreements like the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, LAMOA, and the Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement, COMCASA. These allow for interoperability between the two nations while preserving India's independence. From radar systems to surveillance drones, modern defense acquisitions are strategically calculated to fill critical gaps in India's readiness, especially surveillance and rapid response intelligence. All of this is happening without fanfare. India doesn't advertise its preparedness with bombast or bravado. While some nations define power with volume, India communicates strength through subtlety, and that subtlety is deliberate. There's a quiet wisdom at work here, rooted in history. True security is not found in endless declarations of intent, but in readiness backed by resolve. But modernization must also be understood as a moral responsibility. A nation preparing for the worst does not always mean it hopes for it. In fact, it is often those who most deeply wish for peace who work hardest to avoid being caught unarmed in a moment of trial. India's military modernization, therefore, is not a call to war, but a calculated insurance against it. Because in this century, defense isn't just about having more, it's about being smarter, quicker, and more self-reliant than the adversaries at your door. And sometimes the greatest show of strength is the quiet resolve to protect peace without ever having to lose it first. In a world increasingly defined by blunt declarations, visible alliances, and open confrontation, India's approach to handling its two most pressing threats, Pakistan and China, feels remarkably restrained, even understated. But don't mistake that restraint for passivity. What appears as silence is often strategy. Beneath the surface of public diplomacy lies a carefully orchestrated policy of balance, ambiguity, and leverage. India is not just preparing militarily for two potential wars. It is navigating a complex diplomatic tightrope, using quiet means to contain louder threats, ensuring that when conflict does knock, it will not be surprised. This strategy begins with India's carefully cultivated relationships. For years, the country has chosen a path of strategic autonomy, remaining outside formal military alliances, even as it strengthens cooperation with major powers. While it has engaged deeply with the United States, signed defense pacts, and conducted regular naval exercises alongside Japan and Australia through the Quad framework, it has stopped just short of becoming anyone's junior partner. This autonomy allows India the flexibility to engage with multiple powers without being locked into binary choices. And that's no small feat in a world increasingly split between rival blocs. Take, for instance, India's relationship with Russia. While the West seeks to isolate Moscow due to the ongoing Ukraine conflict, India continues to maintain close defense ties with Russia, because for decades Russia has been a critical supplier of military hardware, from fighter jets to missile systems. New Delhi walks the line, refusing to sever old ties even as it opens new ones with Washington. This balancing act is not just diplomatic art, it's strategic insurance. In preparing for a two-front war, India cannot afford the luxury of alienating anyone who might someday be useful, even if only through neutrality. With China, the diplomacy is even more intricate. On the one hand, both countries are locked in a bitter border standoff, with recent clashes revealing the deep-seated mistrust between them. Yet, on the other hand, trade between India and China continues into the billions annually. Economic dependency runs both ways, and India knows that total decoupling is neither possible nor wise overnight. It uses this economic entanglement as both leverage and deterrent signaling that conflict has a cost, not just in lives, but in livelihoods. With Pakistan, the dance is different but equally delicate. India has taken a harder line in recent years, particularly after the abrogation of Article 370 and the reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir in 2019. Yet even as the rhetoric flares, back-channel talks have continued. Intelligence exchanges, third. Party mediations and quiet ceasefire agreements along the line of control show that India has not entirely closed the door on de-escalation. It understands that while Pakistan may use proxies and asymmetrical tactics, open war benefits neither side. Diplomacy, from India's perspective, must function behind the scenes, not to avoid confrontation, but to keep the conditions for dialogue alive should the fog lift. Where this quiet diplomacy becomes particularly significant is in the global perception of India's role. No longer is it seen as simply a regional player boxed into South Asia. Today, India is frequently at the table where global decisions are made, shaping climate policy, trade frameworks, and security cooperation. Its ability to speak to multiple audiences, Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Riyadh, Brussels grants it a unique advantage. In a time when many nations are choosing sides, India remains one of the few that is not easily categorized. That ambiguity, paradoxically, becomes a source of strength. It also allows India to shape global narratives about its two primary threats. While China projects power through infrastructure and influence, and Pakistan through ideological posturing and proxy networks, India presents itself as the stable alternative, the nation committed to rules, dialogue, and democratic norms. It builds partnerships not through fear or coercion, but through coexistence and cooperation. This makes its voice heavier in international forums, where perception often informs policy. When the world sees India as the voice of reason, it is less likely to get caught in the crosshairs of others' ambitions. That said, advocacy for restraint must always be calibrated with credible deterrence. India's diplomacy is deeply intertwined with its military posture, its economic policies, and its homeland security. This is not diplomacy as denial. It is diplomacy as a shield, buying time, minimizing risk, and clarifying options. When India engages in trade with China, or humanitarian outreach to Pakistan's flood victims, or sits across the table from adversaries at summits, it's not signaling weakness. It's reminding the world, and perhaps its opponents, that war is not inevitable. But if forced, India will not face it alone, and certainly not unprepared. In that sense, India's diplomatic strategy is like a bow drawn in quiet tension pulled back, not yet loosed, but ready. And behind that silence is not inaction, but a recognition that the loudest declarations often come from the least certain positions. India knows its geography, it knows its adversaries, and it knows that in the high-stakes game of international relations, patience is power. Because sometimes the most strategic move in a dangerous world is not to shout, but to stand, calm, measured, and unmistakably ready. In the midst of all the strategy, preparation, and diplomacy, one question tends to be overlooked, but maybe it is the most important of all. What does it mean, morally and spiritually, for a nation to prepare for war, even if that preparation is meant to deter it? For India, a country steeped in ancient philosophies, diverse religions, and a civilizational memory longer than most of the world's, this is not just a matter of statecraft. It is a matter of the soul, because preparing for war is never only about hardware and troop movements. It is also about conscience. And in India's case, with rising tensions on two borders and the looming threat of simultaneous conflict with Pakistan and China, the burden is heavier than many might imagine. This isn't just a military dilemma or even a geopolitical one. It's a moral paradox. On one side, India, like any sovereign nation, has a duty to defend its people. That duty isn't theoretical. It's urgent, practical, and rooted in very real threats. But on the other side is something older and quieter, the spiritual convictions that have shaped the Indian psyche for thousands of years. The principles of ahimsa, non-violence, and dharma, righteous duty, are not confined to temples or textbooks. They live in the fabric of everyday life, in the decisions of policymakers, in the prayers of soldiers, and in the hearts of citizens who would rather raise children than rifles. Balancing these two forces, defensive obligation and ethical restraint, is not easy. It never has been. And yet India must do precisely this as it quietly builds out its deterrence, fortifies its borders, and drills for contingencies it hopes will never occur. In preparing for two wars, India is not just equipping its military. It is challenging its own spirit not to harden too quickly, not to lose the essential humanity that must anchor any true strength. We often forget that soldiers are not just uniforms or statistics. In India, they are sons and daughters drawn from villages and cities where faith is lived, not preached. They carry sacred symbols, chant sacred words, and fight with the same hearts that were taught to honor life above destruction. To send such people into potential conflict, especially on the scale a two-front war would demand, is a kind of spiritual burden borne not only by them, but by the entire nation. That's why preparation in India feels profoundly different. It is not draped in campaign slogans or chants for conquest. It happens quietly under the radar, deliberate and solemn, because people understand, even if they don't always say it, that war is not glory. War is loss, and the mere act of getting ready for it must be handled with humility. To prepare for war in a land brimming with temples, gurdwaras, mosques, churches, and ashrams is to carry a unique awareness that the divine watches your motives even more than your enemies do. In moments like these, the role of India's faith traditions cannot be ignored. This is not about religion informing politics. It is about spiritual vision grounding national conscience. Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Islam, Christianity, all deeply embedded within India's cultural soul, offer a vocabulary not just for peace, but for understanding power, restraint, and justice. These traditions speak about strength tempered by wisdom, about courage guided by compassion. And in a climate of rising global aggression, that voice subtle, spiritual, and sobering, may be India's most necessary contribution. History gives us many reasons to believe that unchecked power leads to chaos. But history also teaches us that spiritual clarity in times of crisis can lead to restraint, to peace, and sometimes, unexpectedly, even to reconciliation. India has already demonstrated this. After devastating attacks, after massacres, even after wars that left deep wounds, it has, time and again, chosen dialogue, moved forward, and refused to be consumed by vengeance. Today, as missiles are tested, as Chinese infrastructure creeps nearer to contested lines, as Pakistan rattles its sabers through propaganda and proxy tactics, India continues to respond not with escalation, but with preparedness guided by principle. That isn't weakness, it is discipline, and it comes from a national identity that doesn't draw power from domination, but from endurance, the kind of endurance born from knowing that real strength is being able to hold the sword and still choose not to swing it unless absolutely necessary. Yet this doesn't mean turning a blind eye to danger. On the contrary, moral clarity must coexist with clarity of vision. India cannot afford illusions. It must be ready to protect its sovereignty, protect its people, and stand firm when tested by nations that do not share its restraint. But in that readiness, the country carries a higher calling: to never let the tools of war erode the soul of peace, to never let security come at the cost of compassion, and to never let fear drown out the ancient wisdom that life, every life, is sacred, because in the end The measure of a nation is not just how prepared it is to fight, but how deeply committed it remains to the hope that it never has to